Have you ever asked a question and rather regretted that you asked it? I was thinking, when reading this, in fact, when Gordon was reading this, I was thinking, yes, it's a question perhaps they regretted asking. Just one example I can give you from work. Everyone's at a meeting. Person taking the meeting suddenly said, oh, of course, and as you all know, I hate that phrase, this particular project will be starting tomorrow. Nobody said anything, but for various reasons I realised none of us knew that there was this project and it was starting tomorrow. And Muggins, being me, I said, excuse me, what are you talking about? Quarter of an hour later, I'm still not sure I understood, but for the rest of the day, everybody else in that room was coming over to me and saying they were glad I'd asked the question because it made them feel less foolish. I think James and John certainly bit off more than they could chew by asking the question. What's quite funny is in Matthew's version of the story, it's their mum who asks the question. She comes over to Jesus with James and John and asks exactly the same thing, except it's along the lines of, do you think my boys can sit on your right and left hand when you come in glory? And I wonder how they felt about having their mum ask the question on their behalf, But Mark, who I think is recording what Peter's told him about the encounter, doesn't spare anybody's blushes after the event and pins it very firmly on James and John. They've come up and they've said to him, when you come in glory, can we sit on your right and your left? And they really, as Jesus turns around to them and says, haven't the foggiest idea what they're talking about. But I did a bit of digging, tried to get away from the fact that, of course, we know the end of the story, and tried to think myself back to that point in time when they didn't know very much. It's very easy for us to say the disciples were so blind, so deaf, so dumb, they didn't understand what was going on. But of course they didn't. It was just happening in front of them. We have a bit of an advantage, a bit of hindsight. Doing a bit of digging, there is a tradition that actually James and John were Jesus' cousins. Their mother, who gets identified in some ancient writings as Salome, who's one of the people who does follow Jesus around, was said to be Mary's sister. Whether that's true or not, but it certainly adds a little bit to this story. Because if he's going to be a king, well then his family ought to benefit from his kingship. And at this stage in the proceedings, Jesus' own immediate family, Mary, and various brothers who get identified in the Gospels, don't understand what's going on. They aren't following him. In fact, at one point they turn up and they really want to take him home. So hang on a minute. If he's going to be a king and his immediate family don't particularly want to be involved, perhaps there's a way in for his cousins. They're his nearest and dearest. They're following him around. If that's the situation, then the question begins to make a little bit of sense. After all, if you're a king, you're going to reward those people who follow you. You're certainly going to reward your relatives who follow you. But even if you just discount the fact that they might be related, they're friends. And kings and lords and powerful people reward their friends, don't they? So perhaps the question isn't as audacious as it seems now when we know what happens later. The answer, however, is what takes them by surprise. We've had various stories that have come to a head in the last fortnight that tell you what leadership isn't, that tell you what power isn't supposed to be. Had the example of a chief whip who's finally had to resign over comments that he made. We've had the Hillsborough report, police possibly covering up things because they were in a position of power. We've had the situation with the American cycling team. How exactly was it that they were able to dominate for so long? That is now being undermined. Everybody appears to have been in on some sophisticated drug-taking arrangement. And of course, we've had the Jimmy Savile situation. All of those demonstrate some kind of power that has gone very badly wrong. The church isn't immune from it. There was a report that they issued from the Diocese of Chichester showing that priests were taking advantage of their position in the 1970s and 80s and were abusing children in their congregation. The church in Ireland has already had to cope with that situation. And I was struck this week by the trial that's been going on for the murder of John Studdards, the vicar who was killed in Gloucestershire and who of course previously worked in Witham. The reason given by the man accused of killing him was that as a child he had been abused by another priest and therefore he hated the church and all things Christian. And since then he'd tried to come up with a plot to kidnap the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he's murdered a couple of people, one of whom was a priest who always said to his congregation that he had a light on in his house, and when he had the light on in his house, anybody in his congregation could go and see him. That last bit is something of what Jesus is talking about here. The very fact that this man lost his life, possibly as a result of someone abusing their position 30, 40 years before, is the exact opposite of what Jesus is talking about. So the church is not immune from this. None of us is immune from this. And even though we think we know the end of this story, we live in a very celebrity-obsessed culture. We live in a culture where everybody has a little bit of power if you think about it. And it's how we exercise that power amongst other people. Because as Jesus said, whoever wants to become great, so it's all right to want to become great, but they must be the servants of the people that they are becoming great amongst. Whoever wants to be first has got to be the slave of all. And there's no holds barred here. You've got to be the slave of all. For even the Son of Man, meaning Jesus, did not come to be served, but to serve. And all the way through the Gospels, you get this. Culminating, of course, in that great scene at what we now call the Last Supper, where Jesus washes his disciples' feet, which is something you did not do if you were the person in authority. You got the lowest of the low to come and do it for you. But James and John are asking a question that I think we sometimes, at the back of our minds, think as well. What's going to happen now I've become a Christian? We've got all this story about, Jesus is going to come in glory. I think I deserve a bit of that glory. I've been a Christian for years. I've just done something really good. Surely God's going to reward me. That's not what's being talked about here. What's being talked about here is not even thinking that, which is a bit difficult because that's the way we're made. It's actually working with people, talking with people, listening to people, serving people. And not just going around saying, I'm really great, but I want to be your servant. But it's getting on with it. We're struck with what Warner said about the refuge. I come into contact with that in the work that I do. And the people there simply give of themselves to the women who need them. I also, because of the work I do, know some of the women who they have been helping, and I know what they think of the help they have been given. It's just listening a lot of the time. Just being there, listening to someone and letting them try and make sense of what's happened and letting them arrive at the decision as to what they want to do next. It's not making the decisions for them. It's giving them options, possibly, but it's letting them make the decision as to what's going to happen. And that, if you think about it, is very different to how we normally do things. If someone comes to us with a problem, we're probably full of the answers. If we go to someone with a problem, we want them to give us answers. What they do is to try and make you think, yes, I could do that, this is what I'm going to do. And then they're quite happy to move out of a situation. They might be needed again, they might move away. And that, it struck me, is what we're supposed to be here for. To be with people in Billericay. To be a place where people can come if they have problems. To be a place where people can come if they don't have problems. To admit that we ourselves are not perfect. But we're here. We're here because God made us, because God sent his Son to suffer and to die for us. And because that love that he showed is eternal. It's endless. And that is the kind of love that we should show. So when James and John ask that question and they get this answer, it's not just an answer for them. It's an answer for anybody who follows Christ. He's not really saying, look at what I'm doing. What he's saying is, just watch, just listen, just follow. It's not about glory. It's not about power. It is actually about love. When these words were written, of course, Mark knew what had happened. Peter was telling him, but they knew what had happened. They knew about the cross. They knew about the resurrection. They were now trying to live as Christian people. Of course, it's often said that the people who ended up on Jesus' right and his left were two crucified thieves. And the one person who was promised paradise was one of those crucified thieves. Today you will be with me in paradise. If you think about that in the light of this question, it tells you what Jesus is really thinking. You're doing my work, my way. You're showing my love in the world. My love extends even to a thief on the cross. My paradise is open for those who will turn to me, even at the last minute, even in extremity. This isn't power, as you understand it. This is the love of God that has been shown ever since the world was created. Amen.